Swiss mercenaries were notable for the service in foreign armies, especially the armies of the kings of France. Throughout the early modern period of European history, from the later Middle Ages into the age of the European Enlightenment, the service as mercenaries was at its peak during the Renaissance, when the proven battlefield capabilities made them sought-after mercenary troops. There followed a period of decline, as technological and organizational advances counteracted the Swiss advantages. Switzerland's military isolationism largely put an end to organized mercenary activity. The principal remnant of the practice is the Swiss Guard at the Vatican. In William Shakespeare's Hamlet, Act 4, Scene 5, Swiss mercenaries are called Switzers. Ascendancy. During the late Middle Ages, mercenary forces grew in importance in Europe, as veterans from the 100 Years' War and other conflicts came to see soldiering as a profession rather than a temporary activity, and commanders sought long-term professionals rather than temporary feudal levies to fight the wars. Swiss mercenaries were valued throughout late medieval Europe for the power of their determined mass attack in deep columns with the pike and halberd. Hiring them was made even more attractive because entire ready-made Swiss mercenary contingents could be obtained by simply contracting with their local governments. The various Swiss cantons. The cantons had a form of militia system in which the soldiers were bound to serve and were trained and equipped to do so. Some Swiss also hired themselves out individually or in small bands. The warriors of the Swiss cantons had gradually developed a reputation throughout Europe as skilled soldiers, due to the successful defense of the liberties against their Austrian Habsburg overlords, starting as early as the late 13th century, including remarkable upset victories over heavily armored knights at Morgarten and Lorpen. This was furthered by later successful campaigns of regional expansion. By the 15th century they were greatly valued as mercenary soldiers, particularly following the series of notable victories in the Burgundian Wars in the latter part of the century. The standing mercenary army of King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary also contained Swiss pikemen units who were held in high honor by the king. As a result, bands of men, sometimes acting independently, other times under the banners of the cantons, marched off to foreign lands to fight in the causes of others, for pay. The native term Reislauf literally means one who goes to war, and is derived from Middle High German Reis, meaning military campaign. The Swiss, with the head-down attack in huge columns with a long pike, refusal to take prisoners, and consistent record of victory, were greatly feared and admired. For instance, Machiavelli addresses the system of combat at length in Chapter 12 of The Prince. The Valois kings of France, in fact, considered it a virtual impossibility to take the field of battle without Swiss pikemen as the infantry corps of their armies. The young men who went off to fight, and sometimes die, in foreign service had several incentives: limited economic options in the still largely rural cantons, adventure, pride in the reputation of the Swiss as soldiers, and finally what military historian Sir Charles Oman describes as a pure love of combat and war-fighting in and of itself, forged by 2 centuries of conflict. Landsknechts and the Italian Wars. Until roughly 1490, the Swiss had a virtual monopoly on pike-armed mercenary service. However, after that date, the Swiss mercenaries were increasingly supplemented by imitators, chiefly the Landsknechts. Landsknechts were Germans and became proficient at Swiss tactics, even surpassing them with the usage of the Zweihander to crush opposing pike formations. This produced a force that filled the ranks of European armies with mercenary regiments for decades. After 1515 the Swiss pledged themselves to neutrality, other than regarding Swiss soldiers serving in the ranks of the Royal French Army. The Landsknecht, however, would continue to serve any paymaster, even, at times, enemies of the Holy Roman Emperor. The Landsknecht often assumed the bright soldiers' outfits of the Swiss. The Swiss were not flattered by the imitation, and the two bodies of mercenaries immediately became bitter rivals over employment and on the battlefield, where they were often opposed during the major European conflict of the early 16th century, the Great Italian Wars. Although the Swiss generally had a significant edge in a simple push of pike, the resulting combat was nonetheless quite savage, and known to Italian onlookers as bad war. Period artists such as Hans Holbein attest to the fact that two such huge pike columns crashing into each other could result in a maelstrom of battle, with very many dead and wounded on both sides. Despite the competition from the Landsknechts and imitation by other armies, the Swiss fighting reputation reached its zenith between 1480 and 1525, and indeed the Battle of Navarra, fought by Swiss mercenaries, is seen by some as the perfect Swiss battle. Even the close defeat at the terrible Battle of Marignano in 1515, the Battle of Giants, was seen as an achievement of sorts for Swiss arms due to the ferocity of the fighting and the good order of their withdrawal. Nonetheless, the repulse at Marignano presaged the decline of the Swiss form of pike warfare. Eventually, the two-century run of Swiss victories ended in 1522 with disaster at the Battle of Bicocca, when combined Spanish tercios and Landsknecht forces decisively defeated them using superior tactics, fortifications, artillery, and new technology. At Bicocca, the Swiss mercenaries, serving the French king, attempted repeatedly to storm an impregnable defensive position without artillery or missile support, only to be mown down by small arms and artillery fire. Never before had the Swiss suffered such heavy losses while being unable to inflict much damage upon the foe. Organization and tactics. The early contingents of Swiss mercenary pikemen organized themselves rather differently than the cantonal forces. In the cantonal forces, their armies were usually divided into the Vorhut, Waldet and Naschhut, generally of different sizes. In mercenary contingents, although they could conceivably draw up in three similar columns if the force was of sufficient size, more often they simply drew up in one or two huge columns which deployed side by side, forming the center of the army in which they served. Likewise, the tactics were not very similar to those used by the Swiss cantons in the brilliant tactical victories of the Burgundian Wars and Swabian War, in which they relied on maneuver at least as much as the brute force of the attack columns. In mercenary service they became much less likely to resort to outmaneuvering the enemy and relied more on a straightforward steamroller assault. Such deep pike columns could crush lesser infantry in close combat and were invulnerable to the effects of a cavalry charge, but they were vulnerable to firearms if they could be immobilized. The Swiss mercenaries did deploy crossbows, handguns and artillery of their own. However, these always remained very subsidiary to the pike and halberd square. Despite the proven armor penetration capability of firearms, they were also very inaccurate, slow loading, and susceptible to damp conditions, and did not fit well with the fast-paced attack tactics used by the Swiss mercenary pike forces. The Swiss remained primarily pikemen throughout the 16th century, but after that period they adopted similar infantry formations and tactics to other units in the armies in which they served. Accordingly, they began to deviate from the previously unique tactics, and they took a normal place in the battle line amongst the other infantry units. End of military ascendancy. In the end, as proven at Marignano and by Cocker, the mass pike attack columns of the Swiss mercenaries proved to be too vulnerable to gunpowder weapons as firearms technology advanced, especially arquebusiers and artillery deployed on prepared ground and properly supported by other arms. These arquebusiers and heavy cannons scythed down the close-packed ranks of the Swiss squares in bloody heaps, at least, as long as the Swiss attack could be bogged down by earthworks or cavalry charges, and the vulnerable arquebusiers were backed up by melee infantry, pikemen, halberdiers, and/or swordsmen, to defend them if necessary from the Swiss in close combat. Other stratagems could also take the Swiss pikemen at a disadvantage. For instance, the Spanish rodoleros, also known as sword and buckler men, armed with steel rodelers and espadas and often wearing a helmet and a breastplate, were much better armed and armored for man-to-man close-quarters combat. Accordingly, they could defeat the Swiss pike square by dashing under their unwieldy pikes and stab them. Landsknechts, using a formation similar to that of the Swiss, were defeated with terrible slaughter by the Spanish rodoleros at the Battle of Ravenna. However, it should be noted that this tactic operated in support of Allied pike squares and thus required the opposing pike square to be fully engaged in the chaos of the push of pike. Swiss pike columns that retained good formation were often able to beat back Spanish rodoleros with impunity, such as in the Battle of Seminara, in which the Spanish pike were heavily outnumbered. After the Battle of Pavia, despite the end of the supremacy circa 1525, the Swiss pike-armed mercenaries continued to be amongst the most capable close-order infantry in Europe throughout the remainder of the 16th century. This was demonstrated by the battlefield performances in the service of the French monarchy during the French Wars of Religion, in particular at the Battle of Dreux, where a block of Swiss pikemen held the Haguenau army until the Catholic cavalry were able to counterattack. Service in the French army. Swiss soldiers continued to serve as valued mercenaries with a number of European armies from the 17th to the 19th centuries. In spite of extensive changes in tactics, drill and weapons, the most consistent and largest-scale employer of these troops was the French army, where the Swiss formed an elite part of the infantry. The famed Swiss Guard Regiment, the most senior of the 12 Swiss mercenary regiments in French service, was essentially identical to the French Guards in organization and equipment, other than wearing a red uniform as opposed to the blue uniforms of the French corps. The Swiss adopted the musket in increasingly large numbers as the 17th century wore on, and abandoned the pike, their ancient trademark, altogether at around the same time as other troops in the French army, circa 1700. They also served in the New World. Samuel de Champlain's map of the Isle St. Croix settlement shows a barracks for the Swiss. The Swiss mercenaries were recruited according to contracts between the French monarchy and Swiss cantons or individual noble families. By 1740, more than 12,000 Swiss soldiers were in French service. During the remainder of the 18th century, Swiss numbers varied according to need, reaching a peak of 20,000 during the Austrian War of Succession and falling to 12,300 after 1763. The Swiss soldier was paid at a higher level than his French counterpart, but was subject to a harsher disciplinary code, administered by his own officers. The basis of recruitment varied according to regiment. In some units, recruits were drawn exclusively from the Swiss inhabitants of specific cantons, while in others German or French volunteers were accepted to make up shortfalls in the number of available Swiss. During the latter part of the 18th century, Increasing reliance was placed on recruiting from the children of the regiment, the sons of Swiss soldiers who had married French women and stayed in France after the term of service had ended. The effect was to partially break down barriers between the Swiss and the French population amongst whom they were garrisoned. On the eve of the French Revolution, the logbook of one Swiss regiment expressed concern that Franco-Swiss recruits were becoming prone to desertion as general discontent spread. At the outbreak of the French Revolution, the Swiss troops were, as at least nominal foreigners, still considered more reliable than the French counterparts in a time of civil unrest. Accordingly, Swiss regiments made up a significant proportion of the royal troops summoned to Paris by Louis XVI in early July of 1789. A detachment of Swiss grenadiers from the Salis-Samade regiment was sent to reinforce the garrison of the Bastille prison shortly before it was besieged by the mob. The Swiss and other royal troops were subsequently withdrawn to the frontier garrisons. Another Swiss regiment, the Châteauvieux, played a major part in the Nancy affair of 1790, and 23 of its soldiers were executed after trial by their own Swiss officers. The Swiss Guard, however, remained loyal to the last and was massacred on August 10, 1792, dying to protect Louis XVI when the mob attacked the Tuileries Palace. Although the king had already fled, the 11 Swiss regiments of line infantry were disbanded the same year. The majority of the unemployed rank and file returned to Switzerland, where measures had to be taken to provide them with relief and reintegration into the rural society from which most had been drawn. Following the occupation of Switzerland by French revolutionary forces in 1798, a project to raise 6 demi-brigades of Swiss infantry for French service was initiated. However, recruitment proved difficult, and by May 1799 only a quarter of the intended establishment of 18,000 had been raised. Napoleon authorized the recruitment of a Swiss infantry regiment for French service in July 1805. A further 3 infantry regiments were created in October 1807, each including an artillery company. He specified that this newly raised Swiss corps should comprise only citizens of Switzerland without mingling in deserters or other foreigners. The Swiss regiments fought well both in Spain and in Russia. During the retreat from Moscow, Swiss losses amounted to 80% of their original numbers. The Swiss were allowed to keep the distinctive red coats which had distinguished them prior to 1792, with different facings identifying each regiment. One composite regiment of Napoleon's Swiss veterans fought at Wavre during the 100 Days. Upon the restoration of the monarchy in 1815, 2 regiments of Swiss infantry were recruited as part of the Royal Guard, while a further 4 served as line troops. All 6 Swiss units were disbanded in 1830 following the final overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy. Service in the Spanish army, another prime employer of Swiss mercenaries from the later 16th century on, was Spain. After the Protestant Reformation, Switzerland was split along religious lines between Protestant and Catholic cantons. Swiss mercenaries from the Catholic cantons were thereafter increasingly likely to be hired for service in the armies of the Spanish Habsburg superpower in the later 16th century. The first regularly embodied Swiss regiment in the Spanish army was that of Walter Roll of Uri in 1574, for service in the Spanish Netherlands, and by the middle of the 17th century there were a dozen Swiss regiments fighting for the Spanish army. For the latter part of the 17th century these could be found serving in Spain itself or in its possessions, and fought against Portugal, against rebellions in Catalonia in the War of the Spanish Succession, War of the Polish Succession, War of the Austrian Succession, and against Britain in the American Revolutionary War. By the 1790s there were about 13,000 men making up the Swiss contingent in a total Spanish army of 137,000. The final role in Spanish service was against the French in the Peninsular War, in which the 5 Swiss regiments mostly stayed loyal to the Spanish. At the Battle of Baylen, the Swiss regiments pressed into French service defected back to the Spanish army under Reading, and were eventually ground down by years of fighting. The year 1823 finally saw the end of Swiss mercenary service with the Spanish army. As in French service, the Swiss fighting in the ranks of the Spanish army generally followed its organization, tactics and dress. The Swiss regiments were, however, distinguished by the blue coats, in contrast to the white uniforms of the Spanish line infantry. Service in the Dutch army. The Dutch employed Swiss units at various dates during the 17th and 18th centuries, although on a more limited scale than France or Spain. In the 18th century there were 4 regiments, including a regiment of Swiss Guards, and a ceremonial company of St. Suisses. In 1745 3 battalions of the Swiss Herzl Regiment formed part of the Dutch contingent sent to serve in England as allies at the time of the Jacobite uprising in Scotland that year. With the abdication of the stadtholder in 1795 and the forming of the Batavian Republic, the Swiss regiments were disbanded. After the return of the Prince of Orange in 1813, 4 regiments of Swiss infantry, numbered 29 to 32 in the line, were raised, of which the 32nd Regiment served as a guard regiment, performing guard duties at the Royal Palace in Amsterdam after 1815. However, these regiments were also disbanded in 1829. Service in the British Army in 1781. Charles Daniel de Meuron, a former colonel of the French Swiss Guard, founded his own mercenary regiment under the name Regiment de Meuron, first serving the Dutch East India Company, and from 1796, the British East India Company. Under British service, they fought in the Mysore Campaign of 1799, the Mediterranean and Peninsular campaigns. After being stationed in Britain, the regiment was posted to Canada, where it served in the War of 1812. It was finally disbanded in 1816. The Regiment de Watteville was a Swiss regiment founded by Louis de Watteville and recruited from regiments that served between 1799 and 1801 in the Austrian army but in British pay. The Swiss soldiers were then transferred to British service. They fought in the Napoleonic Wars, mainly around the Mediterranean. They were based in Malta and then in Egypt from 1801 to 1803, fighting in Sicily and Naples. The regiment fought in the Battle of Maida in Italy in July 1806. Kept up to strength by Spanish and Portuguese recruits from 1811 to 1813. Watteville's regiment was involved in the Peninsular War in Spain, defending Cadiz during the Siege of Cadiz. The regiment sailed to Canada in 1813 to fight in the War of 1812. It saw service at Fort Erie and Oswego, before being disbanded in 1816. Capitulations and treaties. During the period of formalization of the employment of Swiss mercenaries in organized bodies from the late 16th century on, customary capitulations existed between employing powers and the Swiss cantons and noble families assembling and supplying these troops. Such contracts would generally cover specific details such as the numbers, quality, pay rates and equipment of recruits. Provisions were commonly made that Swiss soldiers would only serve under Swiss officers, would be subject to Swiss laws, would carry their own flags and would not be employed in campaigns that would bring them into conflict with Swiss in the other service of another country. It has been claimed that such contracts might also contain a commitment that Swiss units would be returned if the Confederation came under attack. However, surviving capitulations from the 16th and 17th centuries are not known to contain provisions to this effect. With the passing of the amendment to the Swiss Constitution of 1874 banning the recruitment of Swiss citizens by foreign states, such contractual relations ceased. Military alliances had already been banned under the Swiss Constitution of 1848, though troops still served abroad when obliged by treaties. One such example were the Swiss regiments serving under Francis II of the Two Sicilies who defended Gaeta in 1860 during the Italian War of Unification. This marked the end of an era. Modern times. Since 1859, only one mercenary unit has been permitted, the Vatican's Swiss Guard, which has been protecting the Pope for the last 5 centuries, dressed in colorful uniforms, supposedly drawn by Michelangelo, reminiscent of the Swiss mercenaries' heyday. Despite it being prohibited, individual Swiss citizens carried on the tradition of foreign military service into the 20th century, including participation in the Spanish Civil War, usually on the Republican side. Swiss citizens also served in the German Wehrmacht during the Second World War, although purely on an individual and voluntary basis. The plot of George Bernard Shaw's comedy Arms and the Man is focused on a fictional Swiss mercenary serving in the 1885 Serbo-Bulgarian War. There is, however, no evidence of actual such mercenaries in that war. Notable Swiss mercenaries: the artist Urs Graf.